Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So sorry about all the technical issues, but I think we got it straightened out. So here we go. We want to welcome Corey Axelrod to our DHHS presentation. Corey is a passionate social justice advocate and social entrepreneur. As founder and CEO of To Extend, he helps businesses and organizations deliver user-centric experience for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So we're going to hand it off to Corey. Thank you so much again, Corey, for being here today. I'm going to stop my video and then I'm going to put up your PowerPoint. So give me just a second. Where did it go?
Thank you so much, Kellyanne.
And there we go, right?
You just have to love technology, right? Of course, when it works. When it doesn't work, that's another story. However, I'm thrilled with you all, to be with you all here to talk about the impact of unconscious bias on deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Today's topic, there's a lot to unpack, a lot to explore, and I think it's important to frame it in this way. Oftentimes we think about our own unconscious biases, and how that impacts. We will focus on that, but we'll also how to regulate and navigate other people's unconscious biases and how that impacts the relationships that they have on deaf and hard of hearing individuals. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation today, and I'm curious to hear your perspectives, your thoughts. Feel free to talk amongst each other in the chat and learn from each other as we go through today's PowerPoint presentation. Next slide, please.
Oops. There we go.
Before we dive in, I want to give you some additional context, some background on who I am. Again, my name is Corey Axelrod. I'm from the Chicagoland area, born and raised in the suburbs. I'm fourth generation deaf in my family. And that alone really shapes a lot of my lens of who I am as a deaf and hard of hearing individual. I use hearing aids. They're somewhere, hold on. Ta-da. And I take them off today because we have our sign language interpreters today to facilitate conversation with everyone. And I'll dive into that a little bit later on today's presentation. I didn't say we have my interpreters, we have our interpreters for all of us. So reframing that, I need an interpreter and you need an interpreter if you don't know the preferred language of today's presentation. And so we're really trying to focus on enhanced accessible information throughout today's presentation. As Kellyanne mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of To Ascend. And we're a strategic consulting and innovative firm based in Chicago. And we work with a variety of different organizations to address the different elements and discrepancies that deaf and hard of hearing individuals face, whether it's employment, the customer service, the user, patient eccentric service. We dive into all these different aspects: strategic planning, organizational design, risk management, compliance, deaf cultural awareness and sensitivity. And so with that, we're going to dive into what that all looks like. And a lot of what we'll talk about, I'll share some of my personal experiences, professional experiences, and of course, glean from what you all have to share. And with that, it's really critical to look at where we explore where we are, our belief systems, but also it's important to understand how other people perceive deaf and hard of hearing individuals, how they work, or maybe they've never worked with a deaf and hard of hearing individual, and that can impact relationships, those dynamics. I think back to my time as when I was the president of the Illinois Association of the Deaf and working with countless stakeholders throughout the state of Illinois. I was president from 2015 to 2021, 6 long years. And I say long years because when I mention all these different stakeholders, all these different individuals from the governor's office to legislators to different decision makers, ones that influence policies that we implement, I'll never forget one very important person, this secretary of the Department of Human Services for the state of Illinois. We had a meeting to discuss some concerns that the deaf and hard of hearing community was encountering. And that individual made a comment. And it stopped us in our tracks. Where this person said, I have a deaf neighbor, I understand your concerns. We sort of looked at each other like, what do you mean that you understand you have a friend or a neighbor that's deaf? But do you have lived experience? No. But those are the types of challenges that deaf and hard of hearing individuals encounter, that we make all those assumptions. And in that meeting, we tried to describe our experiences, and we had this individual say, oh, I get it. And then I thought, why are we here? Why do we have all these list of challenges that haven't been faced because you have a deaf neighbor that you understand our culture and our community? And so with all that, I share with you today. Next slide, please. So before we really immerse ourselves into the content of today's presentation, I want to do a quick exercise. And this is an individual exercise. You're not sharing your answers with anyone. It's just for you to look at and for you to write down 5 to 10 words that come to mind when you think about deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Now, if you feel, oof, that's not nice, that's okay. Go ahead and jot it down. That paper, or if you're jotting on your phone, it's for you to keep and put away. And we'll discuss this at the end of today's presentation. So take about 90 seconds to 2 minutes to jot down your ideas. If you could wrap up. I'm curious, how do you feel? Just go ahead and describe the emotions that you're feeling right now in the chat. Good, not so good, terrible. Just your brief emotions, how you're feeling. Thumbs up, not sure, thumbs down, please. Love to know. Okay, I'm gonna move ahead. Next slide, please. Oop, back one more, please. And now, this time, this activity is a little bit different. For those who are deaf, please refrain. Don't provide any answers. For those who are hearing, go ahead and answer this. And this question is, what do you believe comes to mind that deaf and hard of hearing people think about when it comes to hearing individuals? Go ahead and type this in the chat. I'd love to know your perspective. What else? We have one answer. Please provide some additional answers in the chat. Okay. I'm getting some great answers. Don't be shy. Keep sharing. So what's fascinating, as I'm reading these responses, they all seem to be more negative. My question for y'all is, do you think all deaf and hard of hearing individuals detest hearing people? I think that's more of a rhetorical question. And the answer is no. Now, with that, I think there's a lot of layers that we need to explore. And a lot of that we'll be discussing. Personally, some of my closest friends are hearing people. My grandmother helped my father raise me. My grandmother's hearing. I did mention that I'm fourth generation deaf, but that's on my mother's side, and I'm second generation deaf on my father's side. And my grandmother and I were very close. She's one of the reasons why I moved back to Chicago. I relocated from New York, specifically Rochester, New York. I graduated from college and I got my master's in business administration. And then I moved back to be close to my grandmother. Long story short, my father passed away and my grandmother was alone. So I decided to move back to make sure that my grandmother was okay. And then she passed away, but we're very close and she's hearing. And I will say that there are some hearing individuals, unfortunately, that I personally do not like. It's not necessarily because there's many different reasons. Some of that are professionals that work with deaf and hard of hearing individuals who I'm not fond of. I'll expand on that. But what I will mention, part of the reason why I'm not fond of them is because the damage that they've done to the deaf community, where the attention and the spotlight is on them, where they take advantage of the deaf community and they further marginalize the deaf community and take opportunities away. Now, if you ask any other deaf person, their answers will be different. And so this activity is tough because you're categorizing a whole group of individuals with some responses. That's tough. And often you want to look at each individual separately of who they are and not lump them in. The challenge is oftentimes when it comes to the deaf community, there are stereotypes that are in place where you categorize the specific population. It's just food for thought. And how do we move away from that? And that's something that we're going to talk about as we progress moving on. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, I am trying.
Oh, that's okay. I think you can just click on the screen.
Let me try that. Nope.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you. And this is a quote. To me, it resonates. And this quote, it aligns with the perception of deaf and hard of hearing individuals of, oh, you're deaf? Oh, my heart. And it's an adverse mindset, negative mindset. So what happens is that oftentimes, how can we normalize this community? Now, going back to the overall conversation, I think about when babies are born. This parallels perfectly with today's conversation and topic. When babies are born, all babies are required to go through that newborn screening, a variety of different screenings. One of those screenings that they go through is a hearing test. They have that newborn hearing screening. Now, if a baby is identified as, oh, they're deaf, hard of hearing, what have you, the team will often tell the parents and refer for additional testing. And as they progress and get that testing, and at some point, that team, someone from that healthcare team will inform the parents, we regret to inform you, your child failed their hearing test. Imagine that. And parents are saying, wait, my baby is a failure? And in that moment, everything changes. There's a disconnect between the parent and child. And parents are often thinking of, what do we do next? How do we fix this? How do we address it? And oftentimes, it tends to be an ENT, an audiologist that focuses on the hearing element and say, have no fear. We have different things in place that we can conduct. It's usually with restorative hearing. or an attempt to do that. And restorative, it doesn't restore, but it emphasizes everything on hearing, whether that's through a cochlear implant, giving children, babies hearing aids, so on and so forth. And it emphasizes on hearing and speaking. But they don't talk about language. It's often about, all right, speaking and hearing, that's the goal, but language isn't talked about. And so the process for cochlear implants, for example, that process is from the beginning that a child is quote unquote failed their hearing test. They meet with the audiologist, the surgeon, and they get a cochlear implant. They go through that qualification process, that whole process. And finally, the cochlear implant surgery has been concluded. And does that mean everything's set and everything's taken care of? No. They have to activate. They have to do cochlear implant mapping. There's many different steps to effectively get to that point where the cochlear implant is working or functioning appropriately. Sometimes that never happens. But it functions to the point where an individual benefits from it. And that process can take countless months, if not longer than years. So in that time frame from birth to maybe 1.5, they have no language access, no acquisition to language. That right there is catastrophic. I think about that critical acquisition period from birth to 5. And they're missing a big component of that age range. That child right there, who's deaf and hard of hearing, is already set up to be delayed. They go into kindergarten, they're already behind their peers. So what's unfortunate is this is a systemic barrier that's in place that often results with on a systemic basis, and it feeds each other. It's an echo chamber where the individual says they need to be able to hear, and then parents say, oh, okay. And many healthcare systems do promote and push cochlear implant surgeries to parents. So where's that conversation about language? Now, when deaf and hard of hearing individuals grow up, they start wondering, why was that decision made for me? And that causes some resentment. Again, it's food for thought. And so I think about the system in place. And I think about early intervention, or EI, as it's categorized. That's something that I'm well versed in. My wife and I currently have two-year-old twin toddlers, and they've been involved in early intervention because they were NICU babies. So we've worked with the EI team, and my wife and I are both deaf, and our boys' first language is American Sign Language. And we've met with the speech language pathologist that our boys do have some speech delays. It's not something that's a concern, but their sign language is advanced. So our boys are bilingual. And now we've talked with the team not only for that, but several other different elements. And because of time, I'm just going to get right down to the point. I think about the EI team, the early intervention team, and that system, it's called a well-oiled machine, or that's how I label it. Again, I go back to when babies are identified that they failed their hearing test, they're deaf or hard of hearing, and I think about, what if we reversed the narrative in that conversation and we said, congratulations, your child passed the deaf test. It's a completely different conversation. Your child will be exposed to a vibrant, unique, rich language, an amazing culture. And your family will also have access to that vibrant community. It changes the perspective and it's a different lens. But unfortunately, that's not the case, oftentimes. So a few years ago, there was an EDDI conference, an early hearing detection intervention conference that happened to be in Chicago. And I was president of the Illinois Association of the Deaf at that time. And so the board and I discussed about attending. And our treasurer was like, man, that's expensive. What's our ROI on this? And the board said, it's not about a return of investment and how many members we get. It's about being present, being visible, because there's more than 2,000 people at this conference that attend. Less than 100 of them were deaf. And so less than 5% of participants were deaf at this conference. You think about, there's something awry with that. So we went to the conference, myself and a few board members, and we were relieved to have it in our backyard, quote unquote, which was 15 minutes away. The first day that we showed up, and I thought to myself, wow, this is a huge conference center. It's near the O'Hare Airport. And with my luggage in tow, and we're walking to get to our exhibit booth onto that main floor. And as we're walking through, we approach the registration booth to get my badge and everything. And as I approached the table, I started signing. And I was using my hearing aids that day, and the woman had that deer in the headlights look like, help, I need an interpreter, I can't understand them. I'm standing right there. I could have spoken for myself, I could have, but my strong belief is if you're working with deaf and hard of hearing individuals, especially children, you should know how to use American Sign Language. That's not unconscious, that's my belief system. Every deaf and hard of hearing child should have access to a visual language. And an interpreter came and interpreted. I said, oh, I'm president of IAD, gave him my name. I got everything and I left. We set up our booth for the exhibit. And I walked into this room and that exhibit hall was massive. It was the size of several football fields, and maybe I'm over exaggerating, but it was huge. And our booth was all the way in the back corner, the back wall, and board members thought it was a bad location, but I thought it was great because, one, it was closest to all the food. I'm a foodie. But because it was near all the food, there was a lot of foot traffic, a lot of passerbys. We were visible. And that was throughout the whole conference. And as we got everything set up, later that evening, we had an open exhibit hall where all the participants at the conference could interact with different exhibitors. And what had occurred was that there was this female who was the head of the early intervention team, and I got her attention, chatted with her quickly. She said, hey, hold on. She got an interpreter because she didn't know sign language. And as we conversed, just chit chat, and I said, hey, I emailed you and I haven't heard anything. And her response was, I've been so busy. And I said, oh, for the last 3 years though? And she didn't know what to say. Oh, and I thought, yep, there's an issue. And my point was that oftentimes hearing individuals make decisions for deaf people without incorporating their perspective. And I said, we're here. 3 years ago, we met and I was ready to support you and be involved and have a conversation, and I didn't get anything for the last 3 years. So that was one conversation. The next day, every state We're going to switch.
Sorry, when the interpreters switch, it's a good opportunity for me actually to remind myself to have a drink of water. So the very next morning at that conference, every state got together and they talked about what was happening in their particular state. Now, our state, the room was packed because everyone there was from Illinois as the conference was being hosted in Illinois. So I went to the meeting and I sat in the second row there at the front of the room. There were many parents of deaf children there seated in my proximity. And that woman from the night before was at the front of the room, ready to get started. She was ready to open. And she said, I'm so excited to have everyone here with us today. And she continued her opening remarks. And at some point she said, well, actually, she said it this way. If this applies to you, go ahead and raise your hand. She asked, who do we have here in this room? Do we have audiologists? And a number of folks' hands went up. How about speech language pathologists? She asked. Again, more hands. Do we have mentors? She asked. Folks raised their hands. Parents. Do we have pediatricians? And she went down her list. And then she made a comment. Did I forget anyone? She said. And I'm sitting there in that second row and I raised my hand. I said, yes, the deaf people. The interpreter, of course, voiced that for me as I signed. And she made eye contact with me directly. And she said, we know. At that moment, I was conflicted. She kept trying to make excuses out of why she forgot us, but it didn't sit well with me. And now the meeting continued, and I noticed that that individual plus several others kept talking about children with hearing loss. And that was the phrase, time and time again, children with hearing loss. And I looked at them and thought to myself, no, it's not children with hearing loss. It's not. So I raised my hand. I wanted to make a comment. I came up to the front of the room. I introduced myself as Corey Axelrod, president of the Illinois Association of the Deaf. And I mentioned that I was conflicted about the use of the term hearing loss. Reason being that not every child has hearing loss. Now, the term loss applies to individuals like my grandmother, who has lost her hearing over time. But I, along with many others, were born this way. So I asked those in the room to please use the phrase deaf or hard of hearing. And the room, you should have seen it. You could have heard a pin drop. There were over 100 people in the room, 8 or 9 of us being deaf. And the room, the mood of the room changed in a heartbeat. I went up there to make that comment, and then later on I made another comment. I don't recall what it was exactly, but at the end of that session, another deaf participant came up to me and she said, Corey, you've got to accept that this is how it is. And I looked at her and I said, no, I can't. We have to agree to disagree on this point, I told her. I don't accept any kind of oppression or judgment of a deaf and hard of hearing person, the looking down upon us by others. And I left. And I walked back that long walk to our booth. This conference center was huge, if you recall. And it was a long walk. I had to go upstairs. And there was a huge sign that I came upon on my walk. And at that next slide, please. Or scroll down, is it maybe? There you are. Great. This is actually a video, but because of how we have things set up, we're not going to show the video here. But really, this was a display board, a sign of why people were there attending the conference. And you may not be able to read these clearly, but there were several that I took photos of. One was a picture of an elephant that was enjoying the sound of music. Another comment, the person said they were at the conference because all children have the right to hear and communicate. Another person's why they were at the conference, it shocked me. The person said to see babies smile when they hear. And that, as a deaf person, reminds me so much of an inspirational poem. And actually, I happened upon that this morning. It was a video, and this wasn't the first time I've seen it. I've seen it in the past, but a person reposted a video of a baby who is hearing a sound for the first time, and everybody responds with, "Oh my goodness, how touching, this is wonderful." And every time, you know, I'm not opposed, right, to a deaf and hard of hearing child getting a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. I've worn hearing aids myself for more than 35 years, and I benefit from the use of my hearing aids. But when people say things like, "Oh, they're hearing," what pains my heart is that that child is not exposed to ASL. There's no conversation about that child having access to language. It breaks my heart. There's no visual language provided to that child so that the child can have access immediately. And my heart just bleeds for these children. So when I saw this sign and then that video, that inspirational video, I think, where is the sign? Where is the discussion about ensuring that the deaf or hard of hearing child has access to language? So now a little bit of backstory. This sign here, this board, was the activity. It was hosted by Med-El, the cochlear implant company, and they were one of the largest sponsors. I believe they might have even been the top sponsor for the conference. So when you walked into the exhibit hall, their booth was right there in front of you. It was large and you couldn't miss it. They were actually giving out lunch coupons for individuals to walk then on to the back of the room and get their lunch. And to get that free coupon for lunch, you had to answer one or more of their questions. So folks were obviously quite willing to do so. And I thought, if these people are filling out these answers just to get a free lunch, you mean to tell me that's why they're involved with early intervention, is free food? And there are many different changes. There are systemic biases. There are also individual biases. Myself, I have my own. We all do. But looking at it, it's, wow, are children getting what they really need? Can you please advance 2 slides ahead? I'd like you to think about individuals involved with early intervention, their intention. And I have to believe that those people really they have good intentions, right? That they want to do good and that they want to do right by the people with whom they're working. I strongly believe that. Now, this quote by Francesca Ramsey on the screen always serves as a good check and balance for myself personally. You can always have good intentions, but if your intentions have a negative impact, it's the impact that you need to assess. The impact ultimately means more than the intent. So if we think about early intervention and those individuals, they want to make sure that deaf and hard of hearing children can hear. Now that's their intent, but if it's a negative impact on a child, now they can hear, but their language is delayed. Did the early intervention individual do right by the child? And I strongly believe the answer to that question would be no. So I think that it's more that we need to use checks and balances in our lives. And this quote here, my wife and I shared it with my wife, and I almost wish I never had. My wife, she often says, Corey, remember your impact. It's like a dog with a tail between its legs. My reaction when she says that to me, I look down at the ground and say, you're right. And my wife uses this frequently with me, and she's often right. What was my impact? I need to check that. When I have the opportunity to do it back to her, it makes me most excited to say, hey, what was your impact? And she glares at me as she then scurries away. Regardless, you know what? Next slide, please. I think it's important that we talk through a foundation of how people, deaf and hard of hearing, perceive hearing people, and then vice versa, right? So do all people perceive the other in the same way? No. There's, of course, a variety of answers and a spectrum of thoughts, but oftentimes deaf people are looked at as, oh, the poor deaf person, we need to help them. And I think a lot of that ties back to unconscious biases. Before we delve into unconscious biases, I think we need to assess, what are they? What is an unconscious bias? To do that, we need to talk about these social norms and ways of labeling people and thinking about individuals that you may not even be aware of. It's just the way the system or the way your life has gone, and we tie ourselves to it because perhaps we have limited exposure to that person or group of people. Many hearing people have never even met a deaf person. I'm thinking about those parents of that deaf baby. Maybe those hearing parents have never met a deaf person. This is their first time meeting a deaf person when they meet their own child. There's a wonderful website. I will share the link in the chat with you all here right now. I do encourage you to click on the link. And when you do so, I'd like you to comment back in the chat what you find wrong. It's a great website. The content is fantastic, but there is something wrong with the page. So please click on it and then comment back in the chat. I'll give you a hint. Click on the video. I see Maria just commented that the video is not interpreted. Well, there's that, but it's also not captioned. And so that page is a whole conversation about biases. And there's no captioning. It's a problem. Obviously, there are systemic barriers in place. Accessibility wasn't thought about in the very beginning. So marketing, or whoever the team was that actually posted this, didn't consider the accessibility features. They just posted it and went forward because that's how their life had been. They didn't think about the perspective of another. So that, but the information, the content on the site is fantastic. I think it's ironic that the video, of course, is not captioned on that same website. So let's break down unconscious biases. Let's talk about those several different components that we need to be aware of. Next slide, please. The first one is tied to normative bias. It's often when people make assumptions about somebody's preferences based on what is typical. An example of that would be, they sign, so that means they want an interpreter. That's not always true. Sometimes, even though I do sign, I don't want an interpreter. I don't need an interpreter. If it's a one-on-one session, perhaps a doctor's appointment, I'm able to sit down with my physician and have a conversation without the use of an interpreter. Now, if I'm in the hospital where there's a higher stress level, perhaps the emergency department, or for example, the NICU. When my wife and I were there for 5 weeks with our youngest, our 2 sons, both were in the NICU, one for longer than the other, and we did need an interpreter at that point. Now, we have some hearing, both of us, and we can speak for ourselves, but we wanted an interpreter for several different reasons, including there were many machines in the environment making noise and impacting our ability to hear. Also, the teams of doctors would round, and we wanted to make sure we were able to understand everything that was being said. Often people would look at us and make an assumption that just because we sign, we need an interpreter, and that's not the case. It's situationally based. The reverse is also true. Somebody may speak very well for themselves, and therefore people believe they do not want an interpreter, when in actuality they do. Too often, our normative bias is causing us to do one thing simply because of an assumption we've made about another characteristic of that person. And that is something that deaf and hard of hearing people encounter quite often, that hearing people assume what's best for them without including them in the conversation. Next slide, please. Oh. This next one is called performance bias. And it's an interesting one. I think it's easier for me to give you an example than provide a formal definition for performance bias. So if you will, I've done a lot of work in the K-12 environment with school systems, and I often ask them the question, and these are interpreters, teachers of the deaf, and so on. I say to those related service professionals that work with deaf and hard of hearing students, I ask, which group do you think will be more successful? The deaf or the hard of hearing? I ask them. And I'm shocked every time, because more often than not, they tell me the hard of hearing. And their rationale is that because that person can hear and speak, they'll be more successful. Now, I tie that example to my own personal story. I grew up in a mainstream schooling environment in a suburb of Chicago. My elementary school was actually full of students who were all considered hard of hearing, whereas there was another elementary school where all of the students were deaf. We were segregated in that way. The hard of hearing students, they used an approach called total communication with us, where they signed and spoke simultaneously, while with the deaf students at the other elementary school, all of their education was provided fully in American Sign Language. That was the emphasis on sign language for that group of students. So back to the question I posed for those educators. I asked them which group will be more successful. And again, they point to the hard of hearing each time. And then I share with them what's interesting. And this is anecdotal evidence, of course, that in comparing the groups of students that I went to school with 25 or 30 years later, now again, there's no statistical proof here, but there was the deaf group who has all excelled, while there's many hard of hearing individuals who are struggling, be it with their identity, with their career opportunities, and the like. They're hitting dead-end roads for themselves. The deaf group, on the other hand, several have PhDs, many have gone on to universities and colleges and have successful careers. Now, I'm not talking about that it matters what degree you have or what kind of job you have, but I'm talking about quality of life. And that's where my focus is. Quality of life is important. And so talking about this, we often look we often look at what's on the surface rather than elaborating and looking at the whole picture. Many of these hard of hearing students had parents who didn't know how to sign. That was the case for many of those students. So communication for many of those students was a struggle in their homes for much of their elementary, middle, and high school years. While on the flip side, the deaf students, many of their families had learned sign language, and many of them were able to communicate in their homes. They had access to language at home. They had access beyond the school day. So many people think something as simple as homework, and I shouldn't call it simple, but just one fragment of the educational piece. Parents help students with homework. And for the deaf students, they were able to be assisted by their parents when they got home with their homework.
And then I think about what sort of triggers that is emotionally for children. In school, here's a perfect example. When a teacher or an interpreter asks a deaf or hard of hearing child, why didn't you do your homework last night? The child, I get that maybe there could be, a laziness factor that they don't want to do it. And that's any kid. Doesn't necessarily have to be deaf or hard of hearing, that doesn't matter. But what if their answer is because they couldn't get help at home? Or they couldn't communicate with their family? That is a trigger. So we need to be mindful of possible and potential triggers. I know I went off tangentially, but it's critical for you to be aware, am I a potential trigger by something that I said? That my belief system to be something that's correct or appropriate. Next slide, please. And so this next one is confirmation bias. And that is the tendency to confirm expectations or status quos over analyzing situations. A perfect example would be a deaf or hard of hearing person compared to a hearing person. Many deaf and hard of hearing individuals, their English is often criticized, overanalyzed compared to hearing people where it's, oh, that's okay. I've experienced that where I've been criticized, and I consider myself to be fluent in ASL and English, bilingual. And I know there are many hearing individuals out there who don't have good literacy skills, but yet hearing individuals are often held at a higher standard. And us deaf and hard of hearing individuals are put under the microscope. And the expectation is that we're not intelligent enough, which is so unfortunate. I'm sorry. I glanced and this is the wrong slide. Could you go back real quick? I think it's 3 slides. One more. Oop. Performance attributions, if you go to, please. Yep. Great, thank you. So that one is where success for that dominant group is applied because of their ability or prescribed because of their ability. Or marginalized populations are, oh, they're successful because they got help. I think about academic abilities, not academic abilities, or academic success, where hearing students say, oh, this person's so smart. And a deaf and hard of hearing person is, oh, they got tutoring support. That's why they're thriving. They had an interpreter. It's always this laundry list of things, but yet we're not focusing on the individual of saying, wow, they did it. It's always pivoted to the helper, or someone got help, or a special program that supported them. Or they got a job because, oh, that's through the Department of Vocational Rehab. I know there are many programs out there for hearing individuals that are able to find jobs, but often said, oh, they got a job, congratulations, without recognizing that they got support or the programs that they were involved in. But yet again, that dominant group compared to the marginalized population. Next slide, please. One more. Likability. Likability versus competency trade-off. Where we look at an individual and how they'll fit in, and will their peers like working with them. I think about a deaf or hard of hearing individual versus a hearing individual. When we're talking about a deaf or hard of hearing person, how will the team respond? Ooh, we need an interpreter. We need all these things in place. Oh, you need accommodations. We need to modify. They don't look at the individual and the skill set that they bring. They look at, ooh, would we enjoy working with this person? Are we able to provide these accommodations? Let's focus on the skills and what they bring to the table. Unfortunately, it's prevalent in job interviews where the whole interview is about, how can you do this? How can we support? How can we hire you? Rather than their candidacy, their skill set, and how they can impact the company or the organization. It's like, ooh, they're labeled, they're deaf. And not just deaf and hard of hearing individuals, but many people with disabilities groups. How do we align because of that unawareness, or they're not educated in how to work with these marginalized communities? If we can go to maternal biases and the debasement filter, next slide. This one's interesting. In a particular job, or actually no, not interest in something, because their family status, their age, gender, ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their disability, so on and so forth. They like this because of that. And I apply it to the deaf and hard. Ooh, would a deaf person be interested in a white collar job? No, they're more aligned with a blue collar environment, because historically they always used to work in blue collar environments. There weren't a lot of conversation in that. I think about my grandparents. My grandfather used to work in a steel mill for many years. My grandmother worked at a factory. She worked on a product line. Both my parents had white collar jobs and passed it on to me, but oftentimes there's all these dangerous assumptions. Because of this, that means Y. Because of X means Y, and not necessarily. Or they sort of lump every individual together. We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll keep going. So we're talking about different types of unconscious bias or biases, and I think it's important to look at privilege and how that impacts the dynamics of relationships. There's a lot of overlap and it compounds. And when I talk about privilege, advantageous or immunity or prescribed to certain groups, individuals that benefit from being part of a dominant group, they might be unaware of the privileges that they have. They've been embedded since birth, and oftentimes it impacts their belief system. And we'll go back, that video, that website where there was no captions on that video. They might be unaware that they need to provide captions, but 2022 right now, I find that hard to believe that that's the perspective, that people haven't been exposed to some sort of iteration of captions. We see it on social media. It's not as prevalent, but we've seen it and we've been exposed to it enough that someone has been exposed to it at one point or another. And the reactions after that or the reasoning behind that, I'm not sure. What's interesting when we look at that word privilege, it's perceived with a negative connotation, and that's not always the case. How individuals use it, they could weaponize it, it could be taken, you can use it as an advantage towards another group. That's when it becomes abusive, or you abuse that privilege. And we've been together for about an hour now, and I've already listed some of additional context of who I am. Go ahead in the chat what me, Corey Axelrod, what my privileges are. Feel free to jot down some in the chat. Someone had asked, explain what I mean by the word privilege. Really, the word privilege for me, that definition of what type of special rights or advantages does someone have? And that's only available to a particular group or individual. So when you're perceiving me, what do you think my privileges are? What type of benefits that I have that maybe others don't?
So white male, somebody typed in the chat. That's great. Are there more? What else? Think about your upbringing. Can speak for yourself, yes. How about this, my hearing aid? Having access to language from a very young age. And I mean a very young age. I see somebody commented, white hearing person. Well, that wouldn't be me, I'm deaf, but I do have residual hearing, so I benefit from that. And there's a litany of other privileges that you could say I have, and I'm happy to share some of those with you. So yes, I am white, I am cisgender, I am a male. Access to language from a young age, I mentioned that one already. Oh, knowing how to advocate for myself, yes. Now, so that's an interesting one here. Is that a privilege, or is that a result of the privileges that I already have? So my argument would be that it's more of what my privileges have given me that I'm able to advocate for myself. So because I've had access to language, because I had access to communication, it has given me the ability to do such and so other things. Because I was exposed to a multitude of experiences at a young age, I was therefore able to incorporate those into my being. And then I learned a variety of different things that I'm now able to apply in advocating for myself and my community. But let's go back here. So the deaf community as a whole, as a group, range within the deaf community of people and what their skills and experiences are. There are individuals who are profoundly deaf. We have individuals like myself, for example, who benefit from the use of assistive devices such as hearing aids or cochlear implants. We're able to benefit from those things. We have individuals in the spectrum who use their own voice. So if we talk only about hearing level and use a continuum there, because I am a white, straight, cisgendered male who happens to also have residual hearing and speak for myself, I would be considered at the top within the deaf community, the most privileged within the community, if you will. Now let's think about that. And I do think about that a lot. Within the general society, am I at the top? No. No, I don't believe so. Those who have, and I'm quoting this, perfect hearing, or normal hearing, for lack of better words, they would be above me. They have an advantage over me. Because language barriers often exist, communication barriers often exist, and from time to time, I don't understand exactly what's happening. The dynamics that are at play in this society impact the overall, I mean, well, they impact everything, but they also impact many things that individuals have, therefore placing them at different levels. There are different relationships that people have, the benefits that people gain from those different situations. So when I think about my own privileges and what they've afforded me, what I've been able to do, and because of my privileges, it leads me into thinking about, because I had language, because I had deaf parents, I am where I am today. And that has given me so much. Those two things have given me access to not only language, but culture. They've given me a sense of belonging. And I think about a deaf individual, and 88% of deaf and hard of hearing children are born to, well, excuse me, let me restate this. The statistic is that 90 to 95% of deaf and hard of hearing children are born to hearing parents. Now, 88% of those who are deaf and born into a hearing family have no family members, especially parents, who sign. So there is a very small percentage of deaf children, 1 out of every 8 deaf individual is in a hearing family and can therefore communicate effectively because their parent has learned sign language. It is a tiny percentage. I'm blessed that I could communicate with my parents. And that only comes from my hearing level. Now let's talk about the fact that I have my own business, a successful business. We're celebrating 5 years here soon. We have a home, we have cars, we have access. I'm able to connect to you all here today. Too often we look at privileges and we think, yes, I have privilege. Every one of us does. Every person has privilege. But what do we have because of our privileges? That's where we need to take that thought. That's what's important, right? There's an impact there that impacts the dynamic and the relationship. So if you have the ability to hear, and then you work with an individual who is completely or profoundly deaf, recognize the privilege that exists in that power dynamic. And then when you start to recognize the privileges, you start to build empathy. And I don't mean this kind of sympathy where you go, oh, well, they can't hear. No, I'm asking you instead to think about what that person's situation or what that person's experience might be. What is their perspective? That's important. The problem is that often we go through life without considering the social dynamics in play, and also without considering the experiences of an individual who's from a marginalized community. Sometimes, and this has happened for many, sometimes that person has experienced that marginalization and that oppression for a number of years, and all of those situations have added up and compounded on each other, causing a person to give up and say, what's the point? So we have to recognize the privileges that we have, and there's many different signs for the word privilege, but I tend to finger spell it. There's signs such as these 3 that I've just shown, 4. There's no one sign for the concept of privilege. There's no one sign that aligns to the meaning and the potential context of the word privilege. It's important to remember that privileges can impact progress. Because people abuse their privilege, others may look at them or people like them and be a bit turned off. Let me think of another example of abuse of privilege, maybe to drive this home. There's many different examples that I could share with you today. I'm trying to choose the most salient one. I think a perfect example would be, let's think about the employment rate of the deaf community. Well, rather, the or underemployment rate. It's about 70%. Now, many deaf individuals face barriers or different challenges to employment and finding employment that meets them where they are and allows them to be gainfully employed. Oftentimes, they're in positions that cause them to feel like, I could do better. How many ASL teaching jobs are there out there? Let's think about that. Many would be the answer, and I hope that's the thought that came to mind for you. There are many jobs. Often, though, you'll find that they are staffed by hearing individuals. Okay. So I've started to explore those situations, and I wonder, why haven't they hired a deaf person to fill that role? Why is there not a deaf person? A deaf person's native language is sign language. They use the language every day. They're ingrained in the language and the culture, and that person is often typically more qualified for the position. Now, I'm not saying just choose any warm body to teach. No, rather find a person with the appropriate credentials and also who is deaf. But why do hearing people get the job instead of a deaf person? Because there's no barriers. There's no communication barriers. And that right there is a privilege. And now it's an advantage or a privilege, which do you want to call it? I don't know. But notice in that situation, I signed privilege as advantage. So I'd ask you to think about that. how does privilege impact deaf and hard of hearing individuals, impact the dynamics? Or how does it cause a person to continue to suffer because privileges exist and therefore create potential biases, where a hearing person is chosen over a deaf person because it's just easier, right? It's easier for the boss to communicate, if you will. Next slide, please. This is an area that I think about quite often. How do we drive change? And I ask this at both the systemic and the individual level. And I think it's important that we have an awareness and an understanding of who the internal and external stakeholders are. Are we thinking about within your agency, outside of your agencies? In VR, you work with a number of different companies in the marketplace. Are those companies, do they have the proper infrastructure to meet the needs of your deaf and hard of hearing consumers and to include them as part of the conversation? So I think too often deaf and hard of hearing individuals are not part of their own conversations. They're not. And decisions are made for them on their behalf by others. And business continues and the deaf person rolls with it. They end up drowning. They may not enjoy their job if they're hired. They're not satisfied in the work that they're doing because they're not part of the conversation. So our setup today, this presentation, I had a conversation with several different individuals from DHHS about how it was that we were going to coordinate this presentation. And I let them know that I have a select list of preferred interpreters with whom I like to work. These individuals are familiar with my presentation and my style. They're familiar with my stories and they understand the points that I'd like to make. So it's easier for me to choose my own interpreters. The team could have very easily chosen an interpreter and brought them in for us here today, but recognize the situation then. I've reached out and said, I have a team of interpreters ready to go and they are such and so. That's actually why we have Danielle and Bryce interpreting for us here today. And again, I say interpreting for us, not interpreting for me. I am in a position where I am able to make those statements and inform individuals. I have my own business and I'm contracted to provide training for you. Now, that's a privilege. Other deaf and hard of hearing individuals are not in a position where they're in control or in charge. So others are making decisions for them based on what they think is best for them. So I have been working with many different organizations over the years, from healthcare to manufacturing. I've worked with retail organizations, and often the conversation is, well, we didn't know. And my follow-up question then is, have you asked the deaf or hard of hearing individual? And they say, no, we didn't ask the deaf person. Well, I tell them that changes today. It has to change today. We have to include the deaf and hard of hearing person as part of the conversation. It's not a situation where we just nod our heads and move on. No, we must position the deaf person at the forefront of the conversation about what their needs are. They live the life of being deaf or hard of hearing. They know what works best for them. They're the expert. So that's where we need to start thinking about this. How do we create that awareness, bring together those many different stakeholders, and make sure we are positioning the deaf or hard of hearing individual at the forefront? Next slide, please. This is another one of my favorite quotes here from Eckhart Tolle. I believe that at the beginning of this presentation, Kellyanne had a PowerPoint slide where I was standing giving a presentation, and behind me in that image was this exact quote, if I'm not mistaken. I use this in almost all of the presentations that I provide. And I think that how can we change if we are not aware of the challenges that exist, right? So it's critical to have awareness to be able to change. I'll give you some best practices. I'd like you to think about these and perhaps incorporate as you go on with your work. This is true whether you're working with a deaf person, a hard of hearing person, or a hearing person. Many of these are just food for thought and best practices that will help you along the way. 1, one of the most important things is engage and communicate with the deaf and hard of hearing individual. Simply ask, what is best for you? Ask the question rather than assuming. I mentioned this before. For a doctor's appointment, one-on-one, I told you I was fine without an interpreter, whereas in a different medical situation, I insist upon an interpreter. And that's not only for doctors, it applies to employment. When I was in New York a few weeks ago, I had a meeting with, I think it was 3 or 4 people, and I was okay. But then that meeting expanded and I needed an interpreter. I could handle the dynamics of that smaller group. I knew the dynamics and what the structure would be. But when it became larger and more interactive, I needed the interpreter. I knew that. I recognized my privileges that I was able to then communicate that and ask for that. Many other individuals out there are not able to ask for those things. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of incorporating the individual themselves who has the needs in the conversation. Another thing I'd like to mention to you all, you may often see deaf people nodding their head. You're communicating with them, and too often misunderstand that head nod as understanding. They take it as, oh, they're getting it. While it's actually what's called back channeling, and just letting you know, yes, I'm listening, I'm paying attention, we're on the same page, keep going, keep going. That head nod does not mean there's a full understanding of what you're talking about. So and this is thinking about the medical environment, healthcare environment, I'm often working with different physicians and nurses, and I tell them, use the teach back method. Make sure that everyone is on the same page by simply asking questions like, show me how to do this. You just gave a list or directions that were stepwise. Now ask the person to repeat it back or to do it back. So consider in your work, how can you circle it back with the individual that you're working with, whether they're deaf or hard of hearing or otherwise, and have them teach you back to make sure that there is shared understanding and you're not operating with any gaps in your communication. I think that's essential.
And I think it's great to be on the same page rather than making assumptions. Moving on, talking about lip reading. With the pandemic and then with masks, oh boy, where do I begin? And I'll let you know that it's not 100% effective with lip reading. I think it's 30 and at best 45% effective. And those are in ideal conditions and situations. Imagine understanding only 1 out of 3 words and then piecing that together to understand. I'll share a quick story with you all. One day, my father and I, we were at home and we were talking about what to get for dinner. And we decided just to hit up the deli at this local grocery store. And I had left my hearing aids at home, and my dad and I went. And my father, keep in mind, was profoundly deaf. He could speak for himself. It wasn't perfect. He was raised oral, but he preferred using sign language, and he learned sign language when he embarked on into high school. Anyway, my point. So we went to the grocery store. My father looked at me and just listed off. And so I just interpreted for my father what he wanted. We've done it for so many years, it was just second nature. So I went ahead and voiced what my dad wanted. And the person behind the counter responded with, I couldn't hear. And I couldn't hear, my hearing aids were out. And I told my dad, I don't understand what's going on. And so my father was a proficient lip reader, very skilled. And that conversation became a three-way conversation. My dad would tell me, I would speak, and then the woman would then talk, and my dad would lip read. And the woman behind the counter was so confused. And I told the woman that I didn't have hearing aids, and she was just befuddled. And I don't know if I cracked that woman's skull this morning because she was so confused. And I look back at these automatic assumptions because since I can talk, that means I can hear. Going back to the lip reading component, one comment or / question that I often see, can you read my lips? Or can you lip read? Can you understand? So, two-part question. And those two questions, it shifts the burden to the deaf and hard of hearing individual. Means you need to align with me. I don't adhere to you. And so that responsibility and burden is placed on the deaf and hard of hearing individual. And it's time we change that and we reframe that burden where we become more inclusive of individuals. And rather than saying, can you read my lips? Say, hey, what can I do to make sure that our communication is most effective? What are your preferences? Take on that responsibility, because remember, at the beginning, we talked about privilege. We don't want to further marginalize or place more responsibility on someone else. And how we can shift that is, say, in a position of power, saying, what can I do? And in that position of power, you can influence change and implement that. When you make those things happen, you start to build relationships, a rapport, build trust. And that right there is so essential. So a few more things. And American Sign Language is not the ASL is not the same as English. ASL it meets the full criteria of linguistics. It's got phonology, it has morphology, syntax, and semantics. It has those four, and it qualifies as a bona fide legitimate language. Now, English, it's a linear language, a linear sequential language. It's so different. Oftentimes, many people think, oh, can you sign English or English Sign Language or signing exact English? And it's so different than American Sign Language. And I pause because I want to talk about what I mentioned earlier in this presentation. And I didn't use the word language deprivation, but I was talking more about the lack of accessibility to language, a lack of language acquisition. Many deaf and hard of hearing individuals don't have early access to language, ASL or English. They just don't have access to either. So oftentimes, I mean, their understanding of English, and so when you expect them to understand, they don't, that's when breakdowns happen and miscommunication occurs. It's interesting because I've met so many deaf and hard of hearing individuals who use sign language. And you see different grammatical structures. Some have pristine grammar, that pure ASL structure, and some really do not. And I'm always fascinated with that spectrum, that continuum, and at what point did they learn American Sign Language? And that's a conversation for another day. And I mean, we can go down a rabbit hole with that, so I digress, but there are individuals who are bilingual, who are fluent in American Sign Language and English, and there are individuals who are fluent in ASL, but not English. There are individuals who might not be fluent in either. And there are individuals who are fluent in English, but not ASL. So like I mentioned, there's this continuum. But we can't impose what works for us onto someone else. Everyone uses English. That means that you should too. And that's not always the case. You don't know historically what they've endured. And I use this so you can be cognizant of that. Be aware. A few other things that I want to touch on before we wrap up. I mentioned at the beginning, I identify as a deaf individual. Growing up, I was always told, Corey, you're hard of hearing. The reason being is because I can hear and I can speak. My own deaf parents called me hard of hearing. That even had biases against deaf people because you knew holistically or overall trying to conform to society. I think it's more of conforming to society of, oh, you can hear and speak, you got a leg up. And if you're deaf, step aside. It really makes me sad. It breaks my heart to say that. And that's my suspicion again. It's my own lens, but. And so now, speaking of my identity, this was many years of reflection of what my identity is. I knew that I felt most comfortable in the deaf community, but how do I label myself? How do I identify? And I always used to say, I'm hard of hearing. It wasn't only until about several years ago, maybe I function like a hard of hearing person per se, based on the definition, but where am I most comfortable? That's the deaf community. There's no barriers. I can use sign language. I can feel at ease. That's where I feel most comfortable. And on my father's side of the family, they were all hearing. And they could hear. And when my dad passed away 10 years ago, I started going to family events by myself. I tell you, I just felt like it was laborious. I would leave exhausted, fatigued, that listening fatigue, that phenomenon. And I'm going this Saturday to an event, which is my cousin's birthday party. It's a swimming party. Oof, that should be interesting. That means that when I go into the water, I have to take my hearing aids off because they're not waterproof. So my ability to interact while they're talking, do I have access? No. And so my wife and I glance at each other and say, Levy, what do we do? Remind them, you know, it's that constant education, but it's that 2-minute reminder back to what they're comfortable with. So that's life. Going back to that identification and how we identify, ask people how they prefer to be identified just ask them. And be aware that a specific term doesn't mean X, Y, or Z. For example, because they're deaf, they prefer this, this, and that. Ask how they prefer to be identified, and then ask them another question. What's your preferred method of communication? How can we best communicate? You can't ask one without the other. You can just ask, how do you prefer to best communicate? If you know that they're deaf or hard of hearing, just asking, how do you best communicate with someone? So you know how they identify, then moving on, follow up with, how do we best communicate with each other? I've got two more. Eye contact. It's interesting because hearing people consider eye contact as being rude. Where if you swap out, if you're in the deaf community, you're not making eye contact, you're considered being rude. So again, I think there's so many different examples that I could share where I've interacted with a hearing individual where they don't make eye contact with me, and I'm like, hello, I'm here. And they're on their keyboard or they're typing, and I struggle because for me, eye contact is so paramount. And the next time, I use this example going to the doctor's office, think about the person who's checking you in. Think about the nurse and think about the doctor. Observe them. Are they making eye contact with you? More often than not, they are not. I think about one urgent care visit. The nurse walked into the room, didn't even make eye contact with me, didn't even acknowledge me, was just glued to her computer screen. Not once did she acknowledge me. I don't even know if she knew what color hair I had. I have a beard. She didn't even look at me. Not once. So again, eye contact is so critical for the deaf community specifically. Last one, and I cannot emphasize this enough. You need to be aware of potential differences and preferences. And actually recognize that it's okay to be unique and to have differences. Recognize that you have privileges that impact the overall dynamic. If you're aware of that, it goes a long way. And you can make a lot of strides and a lot of progress with that mindset. Can we go to the next slide, please? And my question with you all, I actually have two questions. Where right at the beginning of the session, we talked about write down 5 or 10 things that come to mind thinking about a deaf and hard of hearing person. And then the second one was some words that you believe that deaf and hard of hearing individuals think about when it comes to hearing people. And so my question for you, would you answer those two questions differently? And please go ahead and type your answers in the chat. Anyone else want to add? I'll go ahead. And my hope is that you will have different answers. Again, they're yours, especially for the first question, they're for yours to keep. But my hope is that you look at individuals individually, taking a step back and not lumping them in stereotypically. Recognize that my perspective and someone else's perspective are different. And just start being aware of who has the most privilege in these situations, in that overall conversation that you might have. Looking at the dynamics of the relationship, holding individuals accountable, reminding them, communicate what their privileges are and what they've been awarded, making people more aware of their possible wrongdoings, their infractions. But at the same time, position deaf individuals at the forefront of that conversation. I know it's complex and we're only here for 2 hours. We're just scratching the surface, and there'll be more sessions as we move forward, navigating that encounters and making sure that we're culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate. We'll dive into that moving forward. But I encourage you all to reflect on what your belief systems are. And how does that impact the relationships that I have with different individuals, not only deaf and hard of hearing, but everyone involved? And what do I do when their belief systems might oppress deaf and hard of hearing individuals? They might say or do something. How do I react? Or how do you react to those situations? Again, we live in a society where privilege exists. It does. And we recognize that, but being aware of it. Oftentimes, again, privilege reigns supreme. It impacts our belief system, our biases. If you've never been exposed to a deaf and hard of hearing individual, you might say, oh, you might pity them. And I'll leave with this one last thought. My dad. He's always full of wisdom and powerful comments. One time he made a statement to me. He said, Corey, you're fine. You're perfect. You're normal. I thought, where are you going with this? He said, you're perfect, Corey. Everyone else, hearing people who don't sign, who can't communicate with us, they're abnormal. I was stunned. It opened up my eyes. He flipped the script. He took a word and he manipulated it. I thought to myself, wow. And for me, being deaf, that's my norm. That's normal to me. That's my everyday. And everyone else is different. Society's different. And I often say that to professionals that work with deaf and hard of hearing individuals, and their responses, it changes the dynamics, the perception. It reframes everything. So I encourage everyone, as I wrap up, start thinking about how can we positively impact our engagement, our relationships, the experiences that deaf and hard of hearing individuals that we work with. How do I optimize their experience where they feel like they fit in. They have everything that they need, where they don't feel abnormal or left out. With that said, I'm going to open up the floor for any questions or comments before we close up today's session. Feel free to type in the chat or turn on your video. We have 2 interpreters with us that can interpret conversation. Any questions, comments? Rhonda.
Rhonda's saying, any questions from the audience? Does anybody in the audience have any questions for Corey here today?
I'm just going to look in the chat real quick. Someone said, hold on, they're typing. Anyone else want to share anything? I see we have 2 comments. Kelly Ann said, I really like the comment about the burden of responsibility and reframing the question or the responsibility. And that was pertaining to lip reading. Like, can you read my lips? Can you understand me? Yeah, how do we reverse that and say, how can we best communicate? And then Lynn saying, me being deaf, what you were saying got me thinking, wow, you are correct. Also, this is not about being deaf, but it's got me thinking about other people with disabilities, and lip reading or can you understand me really hit me hard. I'm assuming because of that burden. Thinking about that listening fatigue. Kelby Brick, he's the director of the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing in the state of Maryland. He uses the deaf tax. Deaf tax, his word is actually used to describe what additional responsibilities do deaf and hard of hearing individuals have to make sure that their experiences are equitable. It means that I need to remind, I need to educate, I have to align with them or accommodate to them. And so that burden is called a tax. And reframing it, how do we reduce or eliminate that tax? I see it. We have one more comment. Thank you for your comment. Lana, you know, I come from lived experience. It's important that we have a platform where we can share our own experiences as well, so others start to educate and understand, because too often we haven't been a part of those conversations. We haven't had those platforms. So I want to thank the DHS team for creating this opportunity for individuals like myself to create the conversation, to promote awareness, empathy, and to build more optimal experiences for deaf and hard of hearing individuals that you serve statewide. So thank you so much. Rhonda.
Thank you, Corey, and interpreters for being here today. And also thank you so much for the folks in the audience for participating today and engaging in the dialogue here. We want to make sure we enhance the understanding, and I believe that we were successful in this presentation in gathering more understanding for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. If you need anything from us, feel free to contact us here at DHHS.
I look forward to our next session soon and to continue the conversation. Again, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.